Welcome to the Fire These Times. I'm your host, Joey Ayoub. If you'd like to support this podcast as well as other projects, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check out the support page for other methods. If you cannot donate, you can still support this podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening and stay safe out there. So this is a conversation with Zhongjin Li and Eli Friedman about the book that I edited called China on Strike: Narratives of Workers' Resistance. Through the story of labor insurgency in China, we go into the world of narratives and ideas. We explore the contrast between a government's projected image and its reality. My guests do an excellent job at exploring what's essentially impossible to do in an hour or so: modern China, or at least parts of it. We go into the contradictions inside of China's economic system, the impacts of both the COVID-19 global pandemic and the US-China trade war, as well as the experiences of a segment of Chinese workers, experiences which have global connotations and which we can learn from. This will be the last original episode of the Fire These Times of 2020. There will be one episode released next week, which will be the edited version of a panel that I participated in and which is about a recent book that I co-wrote, entitled A Region in Revolt, Mapping the Recent Uprisings in North Africa and West Asia. This book looks at the recent uprisings in Sudan, Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran. And if you're new to the Fire These Times, you can check the back catalog for the previous 54 episodes. Take care, everyone, and I hope you have nice holidays. Please stay safe, keep a distance, wash those hands, and wear that mask. Take care.
So my name is Zhongjin Li. I am an assistant professor in the economics department at University of Missouri, Kansas City. And I mainly work on topics related to labor and economic development. I focus on the political economy side of social development and with the regional focus on East Asia.
And I'm an associate professor at Cornell in the Department of International and Comparative Labor. My research has focused on Chinese labor issues, on rural to urban migration and urbanization. I've been going to China for more than 20 years. I've spent a lot of time living there and doing research. It's gotten a lot more difficult to travel there and to do research in the last couple of years, but it is still my area of expertise, and I've written a couple of books, including the translation, China on Strike, that Zhongjin and I got to work on together.
So let's start with the book itself. It focuses on migrant workers in Guangdong province's Pearl River Delta. Can you tell us what you mean by migrant, first of all, because there's a specific definition in the book, and why that region, it's kind of its global significance as well. And I feel like this would at least help us anchor our conversation from now on.
Yeah, so by migration in this book, we largely focus on rural to urban migrants in China. The number of migrant workers has been increasing quite steadily. Around early 1990s, the number was roughly 100 million. Right now, last time I checked, the number was 290 million. That was roughly, 36 or 37% of the total labor force in China. And these workers, most of them work in construction, manufacturing, and low-end service sector jobs. Many of the jobs are in the informal sector. They really make huge contribution to the so-called Chinese miracle.
I would just add a couple points to what Zhongjin has already said. And the first thing is to contextualize who these migrant workers are in China and sort of who we're comparing them against. So when we think back to the state socialist period, you had a system referred to as the Iron Rice Bowl, which provided workers in industry with lifetime employment and with relatively generous benefits. Of course, China was not wealthy overall, so their sort of absolute levels of material comfort were lower than in developed countries, but they were relatively privileged, and they basically couldn't be fired. There was hardly a labor market at all. And through the hukou system, which is something I'd like to say a little bit more about, that's the household registration system. In the late 1950s, it divided China's population And so people were given either an urban or a rural hukou designation. And so it sort of split the country into these two segments. And it was very difficult to move from rural to urban areas. So the peasantry was to stay in the countryside, and the urban people were given these sort of jobs in these work units. And so the thing that's really significant about this huge increase in migration that Zhongjin just referred to over the last 30 or even 40 years is that, if you go back to the 1960s and 70s, there was very little rural to urban migration. And so this huge influx of people from rural areas to cities is sort of that is the workforce specifically for the private sector. So as private capital has come into China beginning in the late 1970s and invested in the kinds of export processing, manufacturing that we're familiar with, and more recently in services, it's really been that rural to urban migrant workforce that's been the backbone of that. And in some important ways, there is still distinctions between rural people and urban people, even if those rural people are living and working in cities. Even if they were born and grew up in cities, there are some persistent kinds of formal discrimination that they have to deal with. And we can talk more about that if you're interested.
I was actually going to transition to a similar question. Agency is definitely one of the themes of the book, and especially workers' agency. And this in itself is in stark contrast, at least from my own experience, to what I usually read if the topic ever comes up in the English language media in the first place. So can you talk a bit more about agency, and through that question, sort of flesh out the book a bit more, like the strikes, how did you select or how did the original editor select the strikes? What is the book about? Because I know there's something very specific about it. The students who willingly went back to work in factories, all of that. This is a big part of the story that is often not told, I feel.
Right. So the focus of book is more on the strike cases editors selected. And I think this has the intention to contradict to the more conventional wisdom on Chinese workers in terms of the organization level and the activism or the militancy of the Chinese workers, largely because the conventional image of Chinese workers focus on the low cost or even being quite docile on the front line of the production. And this really contributed to kind of the false belief that Chinese workers are quite just following the orders and not really struggling for their own benefits. So the book really shows these detailed case studies. They are stories of strike and the concerns and the backgrounds of these strikes. We really want to show these stories to challenge the conventional ideas about the Chinese workers. And I think for my own end, I would really emphasize this kind of labor militancy story goes beyond the ethical consumerism that we can consider in the West in terms of how we can work together for these progressive projects. And also it helps us to understand the deep contradictions in the Chinese economic system, right? And also help us to consider what might be the alliance we can seek in order to help this whole process.
And just to add to that, I think a little bit of an understanding about what this book was and what the intended audience was. So, we have this English edition, and this is sort of targeted, obviously, at people who are English speakers. And so it's by dint of the language, it's aimed at an international audience and trying to counter the sort of some of the things that Zhongjin mentioned about a kind of a corporate social responsibility framework, and showing Chinese workers are taking things into their own hands, that it's these struggles that are being organized within the workplace autonomously without any support from unions or from sympathetic government agencies. That is really sort of at the forefront of class struggle. I think globally you could make the argument, certainly at the time. But it's important to remember that the book was written in Chinese by Chinese activists, and when they wrote it, they had no idea that this was eventually going to turn into an English book, and they wrote it in Chinese because some of those misperceptions about Chinese workers' docility exist in China as well as outside of China. And one of the things that I found sort of perplexing when I was doing fieldwork in China, studying the sort of government responses to labor strikes, is that I would go and I would talk to workers and labor activists in China, and they would say, oh, well, China's not like the United States. In the United States, you have so much freedom, and so there's so much people are going on strike all the time and workers are sort of free to express themselves, which is, very much not the case. And I mean, there has been promising uptick in strike activity in the United States in the last couple of years, but, I mean, the strike activity has just, nosedived, and obviously we have a very hostile state in the United States. And so I was there and I was like, well, no, in China, there's thousands of strikes that are happening every year, but the general understanding in society is precisely that of sort of Chinese worker docility, and that they have no capacity to fight back. So again, the authors, wrote this book to demonstrate to a domestic audience, right, that this stuff is happening. Here's the process by which it happens, and the structure of a lot of the chapters is to sort of show how the strike is organized, why it happens, and then to sort of draw some practical lessons from it. And so it was very much sort of conceived of as having practical consequences for workers' self-organization within China itself.
Right. I also want to add to kind of the minor point regarding the militancy aspect. Regarding the Chinese workers being docile, that aspect, a lot of literature has been focusing on female workers, but the stories selected in this book actually shows that many of the strikes you could find very active role by female workers. And I think that gender aspect, and you can see the solidarity among female workers and male workers in planning some strategic actions were very noticeable in this process. So that's something I would also want to kind of emphasize. A lot of news reports regarding the labor strikes in general tend to really under-document or underestimate the size of strikes in China. And it's really hard to document these kind of spontaneous and sporadic strikes. So I do think, just to echo Eli's point, this book really provides a more detailed story, and the story told by workers themselves, which will really help to add the literature on this topic.
Maybe I could add just one more point on the agency. I mentioned this in passing, but I think it's important to emphasize that in China, there's only one official trade union called the All China Federation of Trade Unions. And, they have a structure down to the local level and branches within most, large enterprises. That union federation is, according to its constitution, subordinate to the Communist Party. And the consensus, certainly scholarly consensus, and among, I would say, independent activists, is that it tends not to side with workers. It's more likely to even side with management than it is with workers, and sees its role as sort of administering labor conflict rather than mobilizing. And there are basically, I can only think of one exception in the sort of reform era in which a union has actually been involved in organizing a strike. So there are a huge number of strikes that take place in China, but they're all done without any sort of union organization. And any effort to establish a formal organization that's based on sort of membership dues, or that's sort of self-sustaining in any sort of way, will be seen as a real security threat by the state, and will be pretty quickly stamped out. So it's just important to understand the agency that these are, so-called spontaneous strikes. I mean, they're not spontaneous. Grievances are sort of long-standing, but they're spontaneous in the sense that they are self-organized, that the organizational form is very ad hoc and tends to kind of dissipate actually after the strike, unfortunately. But that's another big difference from most other countries, or many other countries.
Can you sort of make the distinction, maybe for those who don't know, between like what we might understand as a labor movement and, or in the case of China, more of like a labor insurgency? Can you sort of make that distinction?
This is something of an academic distinction, but I think it's worth emphasizing. So when we think about labor movements in liberal democracies, but in other countries as well, you can think of sort of authoritarian South Korea as being one example. You think about sort of formalized worker organizations, right? That are sort of durable, and that can organize workers across workplaces and across regions, that they have sort of sustained and oftentimes clearly articulated political aims, so that it's not just, we want, a wage increase, or we want this law to be implemented, but we're making sort of sustained demands on employers and maybe even the state related to collective bargaining rights, or the right to strike, or, the 8-hour workday, or, these are just some examples from the 20th century. So when I and others have talked about thinking about Chinese worker resistance as an insurgency rather than a labor movement, it's to say that none of those things exist. So there's a huge amount of labor conflict in China. As Zhongjin mentioned, we don't know the precise number. It's very difficult to collect data on this, but we do know that it is widespread. But it's extremely localized, right? So these strikes are organized basically just within a particular workplace. They don't extend. It's not sort of all of the workers in one city going on strike at the same time, or all of the workers in an industry sort of nationwide coordinating their strike activity. There are a few sort of minor exceptions, particularly with logistics workers, where there have been these kind of trans-regional strikes. But by and large, they're quite confined to a single workplace. Sometimes very, very small workplaces. I've started to do some research on platform-based food delivery workers, and I know Zhongjin has something to say about this as well. But sometimes you have these stations within cities, and you'll just have like 10 workers that go on strike, just in this one tiny little, subcontracting station. And then it gets resolved in a couple hours. And so it's very, very small scale. So that creates a different kind of a dynamic when workers are not kind of politicized and mobilized in this kind of persistent way. And the reason is straightforward, that the Chinese government is quite opposed to the formation of an independent labor movement. They talk about it in China as solidarity disease, and that's referencing the solidarity movement from Poland in the 1980s, which led eventually to the downfall of the Communist Party there. So they see that as a real threat to their power. And it's also a very competent and capable state. So they have a lot of capacity to ensure that sort of stuff doesn't happen.
Right. I guess I would probably add even the earlier strike or labor unrest regarding workers, especially from former social state-owned enterprises against privatization, those strikes or those labor unrest were also largely localized rather than being really cross-sector or cross-region.
Yeah, thank you for that. And this sort of also brings me to, you both mentioned, both in our pre-chat and you kind of hinted at it as well earlier in this conversation, that things have gotten worse in recent years. Why is that?
I guess first I probably would emphasize the material condition to this labor unrest. Part of the reason is, I think, after roughly 2014, I would say the labor or the capital accumulation rate has been declining, or this kind of the growth rate of capital accumulation has been declining. We are seeing the new investment in fixed assets in manufacturing sector has been declining. And I think that really shows kind of relatively slowing down of the industrial growth, as well as some of the transfer to service sector. The other reason I can think of is probably the more recent trade war, and as well as the economic slowing down in general actually makes probably the state as well as capital less willing to make compromise with workers. I think they has probably become more aggressive regarding labor activism and the labor militancy. That's part of the reason I can think of regarding the becoming mild labor unrest, especially in the coastal areas. But I do notice there's some clear shift of capital accumulation from coastal provinces, where usually labor NGOs have quite developed compared to inland. So with the shift of capital accumulation to some extent, probably we'll see a mild labor unrest in the coastal areas, but more labor activism and militancy in other parts of China.
So one thing that political scientists have talked about in China for a number of years was this idea of performance-based legitimacy. When they sort of turned their back on some of the things associated with the Maoist form of state socialism under Deng Xiaoping's reforms, they were sort of leaving behind that kind of revolutionary legacy to some extent and shifted to this form of performance-based legitimacy, which basically says, you're not going to have sort of democratic freedoms. And that became, of course, very clear after 1989. But what we are going to ensure for you is a sort of a regularly increasing sort of material standard of living. And they delivered on that, right? I mean, China, inequality grew a lot, but even sort of, poor people were not getting worse off. And by and large, their material situation was improving at least somewhat. And so, I think what you begin to see, and this is just building off of what Zhongjin's already said, as growth has slowed, in China over the past 10 years, that there's an awareness among the party leadership that they can't depend on just having 10% growth every year, and that when you have 10% growth, you can kind of absorb a lot of conflict, right? Because things in general are still sort of improving materially, and they're not in that world anymore. And so that's had I think a big effect on the political situation across the board. And I should just say that in 2015 there was a crackdown on the few small independent labor NGOs that exist mostly in Guangdong and some other parts of the country as well, that really signaled to labor activists that there was a political tightening. But in that same year, the state had also targeted lots of other groups, including these so-called rights defense lawyers who were bringing lawsuits against the government. And there was environmental activists and feminist activists. So a lot of groups that were seen as potentially wanting to stir up trouble face this sort of greater restriction, and labor activists were no exception. So there's definitely a connection there. There's one other thing to mention in terms of the character of the strikes, and this again has to do with some structural changes in the economy. The most, I would say, aggressive phase of this labor insurgency that we saw was basically from when growth resumed after the economic crisis. So there's the economic crisis in 2008, very quickly growth resumes. In 2009, 2010, the economy is doing well. Labor markets, particularly in the Pearl River Delta, are quite tight. And so from that period, 2010, really through 2014, 2015, you see some, to me, quite inspiring large-scale strikes making aggressive demands and that are pretty well organized. But because of this kind of capital relocation, both from the Pearl River Delta to the interior of China and also to other places in Southeast Asia and South Asia, the structural position of workers in manufacturing has been really impacted quite significantly. And of course, the US-China trade war has only accelerated that. And I feel like every day I open, I see that some news about factories relocating to Vietnam or something like that. So what that means is that this labor insurgency was really rooted in the manufacturing sector, as has been the case in lots of other countries and other historical time periods, and their position was being undercut. So increasingly what we saw was that the strikes were not they weren't on the offensive demanding higher wages. They were on the defensive and just sort of saying, well, we want basic laws implemented, or even strikes around factory closures or factory relocations. So I would just briefly plug another book 2 years ago, another English translation of a book by a group of writers who did China on Strike. And the English translation is called Striking to Survive. And it's mostly focuses on this one case study, but it has some other strikes in there as well. And it's called Striking to Survive because it's about the kinds of labor conflicts that happen when factories are shutting down and relocating, and workers are just trying to ensure that they get their back pay. And so that's a very different kind of a dynamic, right? Even if there are still labor conflicts, from a political standpoint, it's less optimistic because you're just sort of fighting over whatever crumbs you can get from capital before they go somewhere else.
Right, all fighting for like the social benefits, right? Social security payments, these things. I think that's really kind of on the defensive side.
And speaking of these historical transitions, I think many people listening, they think of China as, well, China is a communist state, and we're talking about the Chinese Communist Party. So we're talking about communism. But at the same time, what you're describing is obviously not that. And Eli, you yourself wrote an article some months ago. The title is very straightforward: Why China is Capitalist. What are the main arguments, and why did you feel the need to write it in the first place?
I wrote the article because the journal asked me to. And, at first I was kind of like, do I really need to do this? Because among, I think people who are sort of serious about sort of studying China, there's not much of a debate. But, what we've noticed over the past couple of years is that in left activist circles outside of China, there's been the development of this kind of current of whatever you want to call it, sort of, let's call it pro-communist party left, derogatorily referred to as tankies. There's a sort of a spectrum of people, some who are just sort of uncritical. Anything the Chinese Communist Party does is good because it's leading to world revolution. That's the sort of the least serious wing. Two people who sort of say, well, China might not be perfect, but if we look at the sort of imperialist struggle against the United States, anything that strengthens the Chinese state is sort of a sort of a net plus for the people of the world, and so therefore we need to support the Chinese state. So there's kind of a range of opinions, but there's a lot of folks out there who have a pretty superficial understanding of what's going on in China. They see a Chinese state that refers to itself as socialist or socialist with Chinese characteristics or market socialism or something like that. It's controlled by the Communist Party that talks about Marxism, and it seems like a sort of an appealing alternative to to the sort of chaos of American decline and the very nasty form of neoliberal capitalism that still exists here. So I want to be sympathetic to it and sort of acknowledge the fact that there are not a lot of viable left alternatives out there. At the same time, as a committed leftist and a socialist, someone looking at China, it is not, to my mind, a model worth pursuing, or sort of uncritical support of the state seems like a big mistake to me. So I thought it was important to just kind of lay these basic arguments out. And the argument, as you say, is in the title, that China is capitalist. And the way that I proceed to do that, I start with just some kind of Marx 101, right? So how would Marx approach this question? As in capital, he might start from the commodity. A commodity is a use value and an exchange value. And when you have sort of generalized commodity production, that means that things are being produced as commodities rather than in response to sort of human need. And if you look at the way that things are produced in China, they are produced as commodities. And you can look at the sort of obvious examples like cell phones and computers and socks and t-shirts. These are all produced commodities, but you can also look at the things that you might imagine a socialist society would try to sort of attack first before they get to the t-shirts and the cell phones. Things like housing, right, or things like medical equipment. These things which are sort of basic to human need are produced as commodities. And I talk a little bit about the housing market. Many of China's wealthiest billionaires made their money in the housing market. And housing is a real crisis in big Chinese cities precisely because of its commodification. But then the next step in the argument, and the one that I think is kind of more more politically potent way to approach the problem, is to ask sort of not how commodities are produced, but actually how is it that workers survive? And in a socialist society, presumably you would see, it might be imperfectly realized, but you would see a political economy that is oriented to responding to social need, and that people would be able to survive based on the fact that they are people. And what we see in China, as in every other capitalist country, is that the way that the overwhelming majority of people need to survive is by making themselves somehow useful to capital. There's private labor markets, they have to go out, they have to find a job, and if you cannot make yourself useful to capital in sort of advancing capital accumulation, then you are unlikely to be able to survive, certainly not likely to be able to flourish. And so there are big differences in terms of thinking about the political economy if you look at China and you want to compare it, say, to sort of a neoliberal, Anglo-American model, right? China is not the United States. It's not becoming more like the United States. China is not like, there's lots of different kinds of capitalisms out there, right? But if, one of the things that people often say in defense of the idea that China is socialist is that the state still controls the commanding heights of the economy. And that's true. But if you look at the percentage of GDP that's accounted for by the state sector, it's high, and it's higher than most other capitalist states, but actually it's not higher than Taiwan was in the late 1970s or 1980s. There's lots of examples of major state involvement in the economy, be it in the classic French model, in the Indian Nehru post-independence model. So I basically make the point that state involvement in the economy does not make socialism. If we look at this kind of perspective of how is it that workers survive, they survive by attaching themselves to capital. By that sort of definition, China is capitalist. And then the final piece, sorry to go on, but the final piece is sort of a practical one, right? The reason that I'm engaging this question is just to ask, is the Chinese state worthy of the support of the left? If the answer is it's capitalist, then no, it's not. And so basically what that means in the context of intensifying this inter-imperial rivalry between the United States and China, that the left can't side with either one of these, right? Neither of these states are worthy of our support. And this is, it's not an easy answer, right? But I believe in sort of a leftist internationalism that has to sort of chart our own ways and sort of form sort of networks of solidarity and social movements across borders. It's an old story. It's not an easy one to pursue, but I think that it's the only. I think that it's the right one.
listeners of this podcast would already know what I'm about to say because I've said this so many times. Unfortunately, I have had my own issues with tankies for a very long time now, especially when it comes to Syria, whose regime the Chinese government obviously supports. And Syria, well, Bashar Assad still officially, whenever it suits the regime, mentions the same kind of narrative: anti-imperialism, state socialism, etc., etc. Whereas the trade unions are completely decimated. The opposing Communist Party is completely decimated. There is a loyal Communist Party which doesn't do much communism. I've seen that side of the, to put it very mildly, of the left-wing spectrum, the more authoritarian side, let's say, firsthand as well. And it's been years of that. And it's through that, actually, that I ended up linking up with activists from countries that seem to also face these kinds of obstacles, let's say, especially in a much more globalized social media environment, if you want, on the digital front. So I can include Ukrainians, Nicaraguans, Hong Kongers, people from so many other countries. And some of the episodes that I've done so far have gone into these specific cases. The first one was on Hong Kong and the second one was on Venezuela. So it's definitely a recurring theme. And I wanted to semi-awkwardly transition to ask about, part of the difficulties of the past few years in Hong Kong, in this specific example. And of course, most people would have heard about the protests in Hong Kong. Most people would have heard about what's been happening in Xinjiang. And here I'll say that I have also had an episode on both of them recently. Do we have any sense of the sort of links that have been built or that could be built between, let's say, the average protester in Hong Kong and labor activists, again, let's say, in Guangdong? And here I'm kind of asking this question very broadly and very vaguely because, to my knowledge, I haven't seen it. But I am curious because at the end of the day, if they are quote unquote facing the same opponent, in this case being the centralized Chinese government, are there these potentials that you see that could be built? Have they been built? What can you sort of tell us about that?
I do see somewhat common kind of opponent for workers in Guangdong province and workers in Hong Kong in terms of the capital they would like to fight against. And that actually was the beginning story of the coastal labor unrest. Right? Most of the capital there were initially located from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, from the nearby Southeast Asian regions. So I do think, it was kind of a labor relocation, a capital relocation story represented by manufacturing sector being relocated from Hong Kong to mainland China. So in this end, I would say it is kind of, you can see workers being attacked by the mobility of capital. And I would really hope this becomes some kind of united front among the left forces in two areas. But of course, the story is more complicated with the political force, with centralized political force, and also with all these kind of other concerns in the movement, local movements, and also related with the relationship between mainland and Hong Kong.
I spent a lot of time thinking about Hong Kong. I spent a fair amount of time in Hong Kong over the years. And one thing to note is that a lot of the labor activism that emerged in Guangdong, I don't want to say it was caused by activists from Hong Kong, but activists from Hong Kong had a major role in establishing NGOs, in sort of developing kind of these frameworks, a kind of a consciousness around labor activism. I don't want to be sort of paternalistic about it. Chinese workers are perfectly capable of developing their own forms of resistance and have done so. But there was a kind of an infrastructure that people from Hong Kong played a really important role in developing beginning in the 1990s. That has come under severe attack. And so any connections between Hong Kong and the mainland have been severely attacked since 2015. And so they've become badly attenuated. When I was in Hong Kong in 2019, one of the things I was talking to some of these Hong Kong-based labor activists, and one of the things that they said about their participation in the movement in Hong Kong was that the Chinese government had made it impossible for them to do anything in China. And so they just sort of refocused their attention to Hong Kong and were sort of throwing themselves into the movement there. So, that's the sort of the optimistic story. The answer to your question about the possibilities now of, solidarity and linkages between the movement in Hong Kong, or what's left of it. It's in the process, of course, of being decimated, and workers in Guangdong or elsewhere in mainland China. It is extremely unlikely, and we have not seen really any positive signs over the past. The movement in Hong Kong has been pretty intense since 2014. So there has not been a lot. And there's a lot of reasons for why that's the case. One is, you said that they sort of share a common enemy. Workers in China don't see it that way. So when they're organizing, they're not saying to themselves, we're organizing against the Communist Party because the Communist Party organizes this entire system that exploits us. The way it's sort of, some might think that, privately, but the way it's sort of articulated and the way it's framed is, well, we have this boss who is exploiting us, and maybe there's some local government official who is siding with the boss, and we're going to sort of mobilize against them. But they're not out there sort of holding signs saying, destroy the Communist Party or anything like that. And in Hong Kong, they very clearly are, right? They see Beijing as being the enemy, as being the sort of the force that is destroying, democracy and Hong Kong autonomy. So that's one piece. And the second piece, and this is the one that is quite unfortunate, and I'm sure you're familiar with this issue. You have a segment, it's not all of the movement, but a segment of the movement that is actually quite anti-Chinese in Hong Kong. And that manifests itself in some pretty nasty nativism and xenophobia directed at people from mainland China. That gets played up a lot, by tankies in the West. They sort of say, look, here's pictures of people in Hong Kong carrying a Trump sign or something, and they say this is the whole movement. It's not. Leftists have been basically without exception supportive of the movement for more democracy in Hong Kong. But you have this segment, and that segment is the part of the movement that the Chinese government plays up the most in the media, right? And also mainland Chinese people in Hong Kong, a lot of them do have direct experiences with this kind of xenophobia, and it definitely leaves a bad impression. So to the extent that people in mainland China are getting information about the movement through official channels, which is how most people get most of their information, what they see is people are rioting, people who are anti-China, people who want to make Hong Kong independent from China, and people who are engaged in this kind of, anti-Chinese sorts of activity. And so that doesn't establish a sort of a good, basis of trust for establishing the kind of solidarity that would be needed. And it'd be, also extremely dangerous, to try to do that, because it would be seen as, quite subversive.
On both sides, in some ways, that it benefits obviously the Chinese government to portray the protests in Hong Kong that way. Its apologists in the West, those that work on tankies, would do so as well. And it also benefits, the more U.S. conservatives that sees China as the root of all evil, and by saying, well, Hong Kongers clearly want us to save them, we need to do more, etc., etc. And in many ways, it plays up both the governments in this specific example, and those that get lost in the process are the actual protesters. And this is a very, very common, unfortunately, a very common experience in my region as well. As in, Ukrainians stuck between America and Russia, this does get played out quite often whenever you're stuck between inter-imperialist rivalries and that sort of thing. And I do appreciate the way you framed it as well, because at the end of the day, if someone is interested in what we might call left internationalism, global solidarity, all of that, we do need to do better than what we've been seeing recently. Although I would say that I also tend to see them more frequently than other people might, so I may have a disproportionately negative impression of a lot of the quote-unquote global left due to the bad experiences when it comes to Syria and when it comes to Ukraine, which followed my experience with Syria. I also recognize that it is a minority, but it is a very loud minority, and there has to be multiple ways of challenging that. And, this conversation is part of my attempts to do so as well. So kind of to go back a bit to the book, you've mentioned, and I think it was in the introduction, you called the book a shining example of public sociology. What exactly did you mean by that? And you also, if I remember correctly, you mentioned that it's it could be used as an instruction manual. Also, what exactly did you mean by that? And how could listeners, let's say, that pick up the book, how can they see this also as an instruction manual?
So I'm the sociologist, so I guess I'll deal with the public sociology thing. There's a lot of different ways of thinking about what public sociology is. And you don't have to be an academic sociologist to do it, but the point is essentially the production of knowledge that has practical relevance, right? So you can do a totally academic study of strikes that is purely concerned with sort of the theoretical implications or how it fits in with the literature, whatever. That's one brand of sociology, and it serves a purpose. This is about knowledge production, right? So they used tools. You can call it sociology, you can call it workers' inquiry, whatever it is. They spoke to workers about how their lives are organized, where they live, what, the food they eat, the way they survive, right? And as well as what's going on in the workplace for them, and did it in a pretty systematic way. I mean, this is not, if you were submitting this to a sociology journal and you had to talk about the sampling method, I mean, this is not like a representative sample of like what the average worker in China experiences. No, they went and they talked to workers who they knew had sort of organized strikes, but they generated a body of information, and you can identify patterns, right, across them about the way that workers organize, about the kinds of the kinds of grievances that sort of push people to work, about the ways that employers and government officials or the courts or the police are sort of likely to respond in different sorts of circumstances. And this is knowledge that the Chinese state doesn't want workers to have. This book could not be published. They couldn't go to sort of the People's Press or some major university press and get it published. They had to sort of do self-publishing, right? Because this is, it's controversial. And so generating that kind of, relatively systematized sort of form of knowledge about how people organize, how people resist, and then disseminating it, that to me that's what public sociology really ought to be about. And so that's also related to the question of it being an instruction manual. And so there's examples about, tactics that workers use to counter police violence. That's just sort of one example. So like what might police do, like when you leave the factory, what kind of a response might that generate? And that's something that other activists can use. I also think of it, and maybe this is sort of more ambitious than is warranted, but I'm an American. I live in the United States. I talked about the sort of declining strike numbers and declining capacity for workers' autonomous resistance here. I really do see lessons here that are more broadly applicable beyond just China, because we live in the sort of neoliberal world where unions in all countries have come under attack, where their capacity has been diminished over the last several decades, and no place, at least among Western countries, more so than the United States, where unionization rates are extremely low. And so the basic insight about, well, when you have a grievance in the workplace, how do you identify the grievance? How do you identify a collective grievance? How do you go about talking to workers in what kinds of spaces, and take action on your own, whether you have a union or not, whether you have laws that are going to support you going on strike or not, walking off the job sort of at the point of production, that is a form of leverage that workers everywhere have. And American workers had sort of forgotten that. And just for the last couple of years, there's been this huge upsurge of wildcat strikes, right? I think marked first, in 2018 with the teacher strikes. But particularly, since COVID started, there have been a huge number of basically Chinese style strikes. And so one of the things that I've done, and this is sort of going a little bit beyond your question, but I've started a sort of a data collection project here in the United States that's based on China Labor Bulletin maintains this strike map where they collect these kind of incidents of wildcat strikes because the official data don't reflect it. We found in the United States, the official data don't reflect what workers are actually doing on the ground, because they're only looking for sort of collective bargaining agreements and legal, informing your workers ahead of time. That's not how American workers are going on strike anymore. So we've started a project that's modeled on that process of data collection that they have in China. So obviously our book didn't create that, but it's just as a way of sort of saying that I think that some of the lessons are more widely applicable.
Right. I mean, what Eli mentioned just really reminded me how this project started. When our friend Eli Friedman invited some of the workers who started these projects to the US, I think in early 2010s or something like 2012 or 2013, to participate in the Labor Notes Conference in that labor exchange section with American and Canadian workers. I can remember even today very clearly when the two groups of workers exchanged their stories on strike and on other grievance. Some workers from the US and Canada side would say, not only like, I think for these workers, they were already clear that Chinese workers are not docile. They would strike. But I think what I really remember is they would comment, oh, hey, what they did was really something we used to do. And we used to do a lot, but we are not doing now. Right, so that was really the story that we are seeing the decline in the US strike cases. And then they realized, oh, maybe reading the Chinese stories, or we know that, these strands of wildcat strikes, and we could probably do something similar even without union, all these different things. And on the Chinese workers' side, they were also very benefited from the stories told by American and Canadian workers talking about how they actually did in terms of dealing with collective bargaining, dealing with their grievance, and dealing with some kind of organization. So that was really, I think, the starting point to consider to translate the Chinese pamphlets of these stories into the English version. And later, when the book was published, Ellen also helped to organize the book tours by the editor of the book to a few cities, talking to workers, talking to unions, and talking to some left journal readership regarding this book. And people talked about the different experience and the mechanisms behind these kind of trajectories, and tried to connect some, or try to build some kind of solidarity. I think that was really helpful in terms of, disseminate the book's idea, also help to construct some kind of solidarity among readers and among the producers of the stories.
We've managed to have an entire conversation at the end of December 2020, and we barely mentioned COVID-19, which is amazing in itself. It is obviously the elephant in the room here, and this is an impossible ask in itself, and so I'm aware of that. But what, as far as you can tell, what are some of the implications or the consequences of COVID-19 that we can already say, or maybe that have already happened or that are likely to happen on these labor relations that we've been discussing so far in the Chinese context? Is it just a matter of, things were bad before and things are now worse in a faster way? And I guess I would couple this with, since I'm guessing it's relevant, the trade war that you've both mentioned, I'm sure it has also had another impactful effect. So yeah, how would you interpret these past developments? And again, as I said, I know this is probably impossible to answer, so good luck with that.
So the first observation I would like to say is, during China's fight against COVID, we see migrant workers play a crucial role in kind of achieving the relatively successful story of fighting COVID. The stories of, people usually were amazed by the China's speed in building temporary hospitals in the city of Wuhan were largely constructed by migrant workers. They worked for the state-owned companies, but they were also temporary workers. They do not really have the same benefits enjoyed by their urban formal workers. And also with the rising need of sanitation and food delivery, all these kind of things related to restricted mobility, we are again seeing the force of migrant workers doing significant part of the job in trying to maintain the reproduction of livelihood. So I would say during this entire period of COVID, we're actually seeing the crucial role played by migrant workers, by these temporary workers, although their contribution was not recognized, or their benefits was not really improved. I think this was partly related to what Eli mentioned, the platform labor, related to the development of the platform in terms of food delivery, in terms of ride hailing. I myself work in the ride hailing sector's research, so I basically focus on drivers working for ride hail platforms. And in the past 3 years, I did 3 rounds of fieldwork surveys and interviews, talking to the workers. And even after the COVID, 2 months earlier, I did some interviews with them online as well, just to see their work and their life being changed by COVID and what the working conditions were at that time. So the idea, I think, here is we are seeing the slow transition from manufacturing to these low-end service jobs, although their contribution has been huge, but the benefits, especially the welfare of the working conditions, has been quite limited. And the job is definitely not stable, the income is not stable. And compared to the manufacturing sector, the average working hours in these platform labor has been much longer. And therefore, I would really consider that was part of the impact of COVID, but also COVID probably just accelerates the deteriorating of this sector. And the tendency has been there already well before the COVID. And this, also I would just add that my research on financialization of the platform economy has shown that during COVID, the influx of venture capital from abroad to China's platform has increased a lot. And that kind of expansion in venture capital really speed up financialization of the platform, making the platform being able to expand and to absorb more labor from other sectors. And that increasing size of platform labor really increase the competitive level of this labor force, which made their working conditions even worse.
And just to echo a couple of those things about workers. So, as in other countries, we saw during COVID a major increase in the significance of logistics, basically. So if you look at the food delivery, the platform-based food delivery, Lebanon, which is owned by Alibaba, and Meituan, which are the two biggest, they were adding hundreds of thousands of workers over a period of just a couple of months. And so they grew really significantly, right, as people had to stay at home, and these were the sort of the essential workers, and similar things with other delivery workers. And just recently, was it last month or the month before, there was a big strike among not food delivery workers, but among the sort of the couriers delivering packages. And this was actually a kind of a trans-regional strike. It wasn't sort of centrally organized, but you saw it sort of trending in lots of different places around China. It's an old story, but it's basically speed up, and it's sort of mediated by platforms where workers are given sort of a piece rate for delivering a single package, and the piece rate has continued to fall at precisely the time that they become more important, sort of given the pandemic. So this shift, and this is just to echo what Zhongjin has just said, China's been trying to affect a shift to the service economy for a long time. I think that that's been somewhat accelerated by COVID, and the kinds of jobs that they're creating in the service sector so far are not good jobs. So that's one thing. The other thing, and it's difficult to kind of characterize, but it's hard to untangle the effects of COVID from all of the other crazy things that are happening in the world. Most importantly, the trade war with the United States, and then other kind of geopolitical considerations that emanate from this imperial rivalry. So, because of the trade war, we've already seen a sort of a shift out of manufacturing. As I mentioned, a lot of manufacturing leaving China, that has been accelerated. But we've also seen, obvious increased hostility coming from the United States towards China. But, it's not directly because of COVID, but in part due to COVID, what we've also seen an increasing number of other countries turn against China. Right. And so there's this Pew poll that comes out sort of assessing people's views of different countries, and sort of the assessment of China in Europe and lots of other countries just nosedived following COVID. You also have the border sort of conflicts with India. You have the South China Sea stuff, and you have Chinese people on the internet making fun of BTS because they said something about the Korean War. So there's there's these complicated geopolitics. But I would say that China, the Chinese state by and large, is getting itself into kind of more conflicts with more countries around the world. Australia is a complete mess. The Chinese Australian relationship. why is all that significant? That's all significant because what that does is it re-emphasizes the Chinese state's desire to shift to a more domestically centered economy. And so Xi Jinping has recently unveiled this idea of the sort of dual circulations economy, and Zhongjin could certainly talk about it more competently than I could. But the basic idea is you have two circulations. You have the sort of the global circulation of trade, and they say, well, we want to keep that going. They just signed this big regional, free trade agreement, the RCEP. But really what it means is they want to re-emphasize the domestic circulation, which is to say increasing domestic consumption, sort of recentering supply chains, and particularly critical supply chains within China, and so that they're less vulnerable to foreign shocks, in part as they see this more hostile world, of course, led by the United States. But again, we're seeing more hostility from the EU, from Australia, from India, etc. So that is really significant. And this is not new. I mean, you can go back to 2003, 2004 and see Wen Jiabao, who was the premier at the time, saying, we need to increase domestic consumption. Part of the reason they can't do that is because they have this wage repression, and all of the jobs that they're creating are low paid, so they don't actually have the consumers domestically. But so, again, just to sort of say that it's very difficult to disentangle like which pieces of that are caused by COVID and sort of racist targeting of China as being the reason that Western countries are suffering. That that's maybe part of it, but then there's also this broader sort of economic structural situation, all of which I think is militating towards sort of China becoming more inwardly focused.
Well, first, I really appreciate the time the two of you have given me. This has really been really informative. I'm hoping, and I think it's going to be the same for our listeners as well. You've mentioned the recent shifts towards financialization. And Zhongjin, you said that you have also been shifting your research focus towards that. So can we use that as your own closing note, and at the same time mention the projects that you are working on and where people listening to this can find you online or find your work online as well, if that's okay?
The work has not been published yet. It's still under review, but I do want to close the kind of my point by emphasizing Eli's point regarding dual circulation strategy. It's very clear that the Chinese economy is still heavily reliant on the overseas market, especially technology. I think the emphasis of the strategy should really make people aware that how dependent China's economy is on the overseas market and technology abroad, rather than being really able to develop its own technology. And the reason regarding the domestic market, especially during COVID or being hit by COVID, I think it is increasingly clear that there's a large section of the Chinese population is still very poor. It's not because people don't spend, don't consume, they save. It's simply because they don't have enough income to spend, to consume. So really, I think it calls for more significant, more radical income distribution, as well as the restructure of the economy. But we are not really seeing that in the Chinese state, as well as in any centralized policy-making circle. So I kind of really, I'm still looking for forward to more radical policies, as well as more bottom-up pressure for more progressive forces or more progressive changes in the Chinese economy, as well as regarding its influence overseas.
I guess if I want to sort of leave listeners with one thing, the China on Strike book and a lot of the research that I and Zhongjin and others have done on worker protest, one of the things that really sort of motivates me to do it, and I think is particularly important now, is really to identify the commonality of struggles of poor people across different countries, right? Mm-hmm. And it goes without saying, again, I'm an American. We hear so much about conflict between the United States and China, and so many efforts on the part of both the American state and the Chinese state to sort of drive a wedge between these two countries and force other countries around the world to sort of pick sides. When we approach this question of geopolitics from the perspective of workers, it's not to say that workers are themselves not nationalists sometimes. They certainly are in both of these countries. But they have common interests, and this is an old story, but oftentimes their enemies are precisely the same corporations. I mean, we don't get Apple in its current form without Chinese workers. China is the largest market for General Motors. And Walmart doesn't exist in its current form without the exploitation of Chinese workers. And the United States is now TikTok's biggest market, right? So the capitalists in both these countries, they're able to sort of build these vast, global supply chains, incorporating sort of junior partners in, say, Taiwan or Hong Kong or South Korea. They're able to cooperate, right, to exploit workers around the world. And I just think that poor people and workers across these different countries have a lot more in common with each other than they do with the elites that run their countries. And so I think that this book does a really nice job revealing that. And even when we turn, the sort of the stuff in this book at this point is already a bit old, right? It's sort of getting up close to 10 years old, and China has changed a lot. The United States and Europe have changed a lot since then. But even if we're looking at the sort of the more recent stuff, we've just been talking about developments in the platform economy and strikes that are happening among delivery workers or food delivery workers. I mean, the same stuff is happening in the United States. Like, here it's maybe Uber or Grubhub or whatever, but the same sort of pushing risk downwards onto workers, algorithmic forms of control, as well as the kinds of resistance. I mean, there's much more resistance in China than there is in the United States for a whole variety of reasons. But the kind of resistance we're seeing among workers in the US is increasingly, like I said, kind of looks Chinese-like in nature. It's very fractured, it's very small scale, it's without the support of collective bargaining agreements or any legal protection. And so we really do see these commonalities on sort of both sides of this imperial conflict.
Well, on that note, thank you both for your time. This has really been great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.